Okay, I think I'm back. I don't know if this like opens the previous stream. I guess it doesn't look like it does. I have no viewers. I don't, does it like amend it or something? No, I don't think it does. But you know, stream's going again. Anyway, I'm back. If you were watching it previously, here's the second part. A link? Give me a sec. I'll get a link for everybody. I can put it in Discord. That part's easy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you're right.
Let's see here. Wow, my computer just crashed. That sucked. Somebody says the CIA finally managed to get him.
Yeah, the CIA did this.
That's funny. All right, here's the new link. I gotta link it to everybody. It's annoying. All right, there we go. Welcome back, everybody. Not everybody yet, I suppose. Yeah, my computer just straight up crashed. It gave me like all kinds of weird looking glitches. I took a picture. Let me see if I can show it to the peoples real quick. Can I flip it like this? Oh, no, that's not what I'm looking for. Come on. Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is what my screen ended up looking like. Look at that. Super weird, just like completely glitched out stuff. And then up in this corner, you can see it's like, things went bad. We're restarting your computer and collecting error info. It just glitched bad. This computer's been having problems lately. I actually don't know what's wrong with it. I can't tell what component in my computer is causing the issue. It keeps having these problems where it kind of has like really serious slowdowns, and sometimes it freezes, sometimes the screen glitches out. And, you know, I'd entertained that it was either the video card or the processor. And, you know, it's kind of hard to tell which it might be. I think there's decent arguments for it being either, but things started to get better when I cleared out my hard drive. So like when I like moved a bunch of stuff I had on the main partition for my operating system on the hard drive, it started to get better. I didn't get slowdowns or freezes anymore. And I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe it's just that there wasn't enough room on the hard drive. And, you know, I wasn't sure how that really made sense, but it seemed to make a change in the running of the computer. However, the hard drive is now fine and the computer just straight crashed. And my conception is that that would be the processor, but numerous people have told me they think that it's the GPU. They think it's the video card. I really couldn't say either way. All I know is either is going to be expensive, and that really sucks. Yeah, I don't know. Kind of makes me afraid of what might happen. You know, I don't have like any excess money. So if one of the parts of this computer, you know, either the CPU or the GPU dies, that's really going to suck. I will either have to trust to the generosity of my viewers, or I will have to get a credit card, which I've been avoiding for 38 years of my life. Bad motherboard. I guess that's possible. I don't find that super likely, but it's possible, I suppose. Create a GoFundMe. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. That might be what ends up happening. Yeah, that's a gnarly crash. It sure is. That was a bad one right there. Hypnosis. How old is the computer? Not very old. I built it right before the pandemic started because I had money saved right before the pandemic, and I could see that the cost of all of the parts was going up, especially like video cards, like really fast. And I realized that even though I didn't want to spend my savings, I needed to spend my savings because the cost of computer parts never goes back down. So if it was going up, then I needed to buy immediately. And so I dumped all my savings into building this computer right before the pandemic really got going. And I'm glad I did, because I was right. The parts just kept going up and up and up. This computer, I wouldn't even be able to build this computer if I tried to build it today. So I'm really surprised that I'm having these problems. I'm not sure, and I guess it sucks as well because I'm really not sure what exact component it is. It's not easy to swap out a processor either. It's kind of a whole pain in the ass having to replace all of the cooling gel and everything on it. But yeah, I guess I could try other things. We'll see what happens. Somebody says, your list being freely editable is the true test of human nature. I knew that when I did that, I was trusting y'all not to mess it up. But it's a copy of the original list. So even if somebody did something kind of, dastardly, it wouldn't make a huge difference. It would just suck because other people's contributions would disappear. However, the nice thing about Google Docs is that it actually stores all of the version histories. So we can just, that's what version control is for, as somebody says. So, it can just be restored to whatever version there was right before somebody deleted it or messed with it or deleted, aspects of it. It's clear when all of those edits take place in the version histories. So Andrew P. says, question, Zoe Baker in Means and Ends says that anarchism is based on freedom, equality, and solidarity, and it seeks to build a society on those ideals. Aren't those liberal values, and isn't that idealism? Well, first of all, every system has values. That's just how systems of ideas work. And you start by having some sorts of values that you are attempting to maximize, and you are either attempting to find out how they are maximized or are not maximized in society. And, then you recognize how that might take place after you have started with your value system. Marxism is no different. Every system has values. In Marxism, all they're doing is they're recognizing that the changes in society generally take place by the changing of the economic base. So that being said, how that economic base changes and how we might be operative in changing that economic base is still a matter of having values we want to see carried out. And the claim that it is inevitable does not appear to be the case. So what we see is we have options. We can either give in to fascism, for example, which has its own value system, or we can fight to create something like communism, which is a different value system. It's a value system which empowers the masses. And in that sense, everybody just has a value system. There's no way to escape having a value system. And in political theory, we're dealing with human beings. We're not dealing with just the procession of particles bouncing into one another. And so, when we are analyzing how human societies change, we have to understand how human conceptions, human relations, human society itself is formed on the changing of values. That's the answer to the first part. But the second part is, aren't those liberal values? No, or rather, they are similar to some liberal values. It's been said before, that it's freedom, equality, fraternity. Yes. However, they don't really create a society that lives up to those values, right? Because capitalism has failed to create those values in society. It has failed to create a society of freedom. Instead, it has created an extremely constrained society, an almost mechanical society, wherein the only people who have any degree of freedom are those that are at the very top, who have all the power and therefore have some considerable amount of decision-making power. However, I would argue even they do not have freedom in the truest sense. We surely are not looking at a society of equality, and here we mean equality of structural power. We don't mean like this equality before the law stuff. We mean equality of structural power more broadly, people's access to structural power. And insofar as we're talking about solidarity, once again, so capitalism has not created a society of solidarity. What we see is that it is, in fact, a society of atomization, a society that destroys bonds of solidarity, is a society that makes people more and more and more isolated, and it destroys more and more of the structures of interpersonality and sociality that exist. So even if you were to say those were liberal values, liberals have not in any way created a system which creates those values, which nourishes those values more broadly. But also, as River Rune points out, these are material factors. You know, freedom, we often in physics call this degrees of freedom, right? You know, solidarity, we're talking about cooperative bonds. You know, this has meaning in things like game theory. This has meaning back in systems theory again. Complex systems are systems where there is high degrees of coupling between all of the pieces. And that's what cooperation is. That's what solidarity is, right? This is not an ephemeral idea resting out in some realm of ideas. We're talking about things that are very grounded in real facts. And, you know, the equality, like I said, that's equality of structural power. That is actual access to power in society and the ability to carry out in one's will, to enact one's will. So what we see here is these are real structural elements. These are not just ideas out in a realm of Platonic concepts, right? I've got people DMing me and stuff being like, oh no, what happened to the stream? So I'm responding to them now. Andrew P. says, okay, so as I understand it, the values of anarchism are social versions of the individualistic values of liberalism. Makes sense to me now. Yeah, I think that's probably one way to conceive of it. And it kind of makes sense as to how some Marxists, when they mistakenly think that anarchism is individualistic and they don't recognize that it has a social and an individual component, will critique it as being liberal. However, it's that they haven't understood what I basically just laid out, which is that these are social values for the anarchists. So Angus IW donated $3. I appreciate it. They say, read Conquest of Bread or Mutual Aid first. Honestly, I don't know if either of those are great introductory texts. Weirdly, Conquest of Bread has been recommended as an introductory text to a lot of people. However, I personally don't really view it that way. Mutual Aid, I don't know if I would consider that a good text as an introduction to anarchism, but it is imperative if you're trying to understand the impulse of solidarity in not only human societies, but more generally within the animal kingdom, recognizing how it has its roots preceding human society, and that we simply carry out one of many viable evolutionary strategies when we create these bonds of cooperation and direct distribution and interpersonal assistance. I think that if you're trying to understand that, then Mutual Aid is a great book to read. Conquest of Bread lays out a lot of the basic arguments of anarcho-communism really well and gives a pretty good functional understanding of how that might be set up and managed. However, I fear that it's a little bit outdated. I think that it kind of applies more to like agrarian economies rather than modern economies. So if you read Conquest of Bread, number one, kind of like prepare yourself for something that might be not an intro text. And number two, recognize that we would have to considerably modify what Kropotkin is saying there for it to apply to current circumstances. You shouldn't be here says mutual aid is actual scientific socialism. Yeah, though, legit. Like it actually is. This is something I've noted is kind of funny about the phrase scientific socialism being used by Marxists is that the majority of theorists who were writing during that time that were scientists were anarchists. You know, like that was actually that more anarchists were scientists than Marxists were. Most of the Marxists were academics, they were, generally they were just kind of academics more broadly, but the anarchists were actual practicing scientists a lot of the time. Another one, for example, is Élisée Reclus, who was a practicing geographer. Long Defiant says, would it be accurate to say that anarchists advocate for social rights over individual rights? I think it would be most accurate to say that they advocate for both simultaneously. They're looking for a harmony of the social and the individual. I guess I should note that I mean this for the social anarchists. The social anarchists have a simultaneous recognition of the social and the individual, whereas in my experience, the individualist anarchists seem almost only concerned with the individual. But in a general sense, the majority of the historic movement has been social anarchist. So I'm speaking broadly here when I say that anarchism mostly focuses around the harmony of the social and the individual. Fazboy says, do you believe communalism is anarchism? It's hard, because if you listen to what Bookchin is saying in the text where he introduces communalism, he advocates, for example, for majoritarianism. And I think most anarchists would agree that we don't want to advocate for majoritarianism. However, it should be said, historically, anarchists have even used majoritarianism in certain circumstances. The key is in recognizing that we should consent to the system that is being used beforehand. So if everybody agrees to majoritarianism, it's okay to use that. But I think that in general, you should be defaulting to a consensus system. So I disagree with Bookchin on that. And that is generally the only major point in the text where he describes what communalism is, where Bookchin actually even differs from anarchists more broadly. That is the tiny distinction at hand, is that anarchists in general would not advocate majoritarianism. They would say that maybe sometimes it's necessary in certain circumstances, insofar as it's not compulsory. Whereas Bookchin is arguing that majoritarianism should become the basis for how we make decisions within our spaces. So that's the reason I don't call myself a communalist. I remain an anarchist. And truthfully, I think that Bookchin, and he even kind of says this in that same essay, I think Bookchin just didn't want to be associated with the lifestylist anarchists of the 90s and the 80s and 90s and so on. He was an anarchist in the social anarchist tradition. He was an anarcho-syndicalist. He was very inspired by things like the C&T FAI. And this had sort of fallen out of fashion starting from the 60s up until the end of his life. And I think he was kind of frustrated being associated with a movement that seemed like it was that it was not capable of building actual power, and that it had become so vulgarized, he didn't really recognize the tradition that he hailed from within the movement anymore. People were trying to tell him he wasn't an anarchist for being a social anarchist, basically. And yeah, I think that he was looking for a way to maintain the tradition of social anarchism while getting rid of the stigmatized name anarchist. And so in that essay, he also just says, like, this word communalist just doesn't have a nasty history. It's not stigmatized. It is able to communicate the ideas to people without them becoming defensive, without getting their hackles up. And yeah, for me, I would say he's probably right. I think that communalism does communicate better to people in that sense. If you tell them you're a communalist, they don't have like any knee-jerk reactions. They might be a little confused because they've never heard of it before, but it does allow an open space for the discussion of the ideas. And I think that's why, for example, a lot of the cooperations have actually been very successful, and that they've gotten a lot done, and they have kind of a diverse horizontalist membership. And it's because that word is not associated with the sort of vulgar ideas of those who are just obsessed with street protests and insurrection for the joy of insurrection, and without any building praxis, without any constructive or prefigurative praxis. And I think that therefore communalist kind of does appeal to people in that sense. However, it's interesting because even with all that in mind, these communalist organizations like the cooperatives end up being filled full of anarchists. So clearly there is an enormous amount of overlap. Murray Bookchin was an anarchist his entire life until late in his life. And I think he kind of was just being a grumpy old man later in life. So is communalism anarchism? Probably barely not, just because it advocates for direct democracy, for majoritarianism, but it's barely different. Andrew P. says, if you don't like lifestyle anarchism, then what's your take on the Situationists? Have you read Society of the Spectacle? I have read Society of the Spectacle, but that didn't, of course, teach me very much about the Situationists. I kind of know a little bit about them just from kind of like skimming a Wikipedia article, but I really would not consider that qualification to make commentary on it. But I did really like Society of the Spectacle. I think it is a fantastic work, which has really stood the test of time, to the degree where I think a lot of the commentary he was making, which was referring to television, is way more pertinent now that the internet exists. I think that if he thought that television was creating the Society of the Spectacle, wow, the internet is the Society of the Spectacle on steroids. It's really just gone wildly out of control. The spectacle is now itself the way that power circulates. Daniel Plainview says, my experience in communalism is that it will devolve into violence. That's really weird because there's no examples of communalism devolving into violence. Okay. He thinks Chop Chaz was communalism. Yeah, Chop Chaz was basically no kind of ideology. If anything, I would say it might be considered like non-organizationalist anarchism, but most anarchists that I am around, at least that are in this space, are social anarchists and are more pro-organization. So when I look at Chop Chaz, I see something that failed because it didn't have organization. They needed to establish council structures early on, and those council structures needed to be directly democratic, general assembly structures, which met every day, where everyone was participating, and power should have been held there. There should have been, coordination. There should have been the creation of agreements. There should have been a charter for the autonomous zone. Unfortunately, it had none of this. Insofar as that there was any council structure, it was just a place where everybody kind of just got together and talked, and there was no formal decisions made. There was no acts of, formal coordination. They had no binding agreements. And it just led to everything being very chaotic and disorganized and incapable of mustering any sort of defense for itself. And the time finally came that the state wanted to take it back. Yeah. So I look at Chaz Chop as having been a failure of anti-organizationalism. Thomas Beaver points out, Bookchin actually started out as a Marxist. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I suppose maybe in that previous statement, you're just saying that I said that Bookchin started out as an anarcho-syndicalist, but I'm basically just saying that the most influential part of his life, when he first began writing theory and becoming involved he was an anarcho-syndicalist. I think he was like a Trotskyist before that or something. But yeah, that wasn't a very important period in Bookchin's life as a theorist. Pervin Wall says, can you help me understand how does Marxist materialism relate to current science? While going deeper into the physics of matter, I got lost about how to understand that While going deeper into the physics of matter, I got lost about how to understand that theory. What is material? Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it should be said that when Marxists are using this word materialism, it really doesn't have a whole lot of relation to actual materialism in that sense. But that's mostly just a modern thing. When they originally used this phrase, materialism, they basically were just trying to fight back against the fact that the dominant trend was idealism, or specifically German idealism, which believed that ideas alone drive the wheels of history. And what the Marxists were trying to point out was that no, the material conditions of society, the orientation of economics, the way that the means of production are constructed and controlled, these things drive the changes in society. And our relation to those things as classes, it creates positions of conflict, and the conflict between these positions in relation to material things like the means of production determine the content of that conflict, how we will interact as classes with one another, and that generally who owns the means of production stands in opposition to those who operate the means of production, and that this creates a conflict between these classes that have differing interests based on their relation to those things. So then now with that in hand, you can see that it doesn't really have a whole lot to say about the concept of materialism in a philosophical sense, nor does it really give us any tools to understand how science really functions. So I think that when people then start talking about like dialectical materialism being a science, that this is pure nonsense. I think this is absolutely false. It not only does not rise to the level of a science at the sociological level, but it does not even give us any understanding of science more broadly, and even contradicts some of the science we began to find as we proceeded into the 1900s and uncovered quantum mechanics and special and general relativity. As you say, even what would be defined as matter became more challenging, to the degree where now most physicists are not materialists, they are physicalists, because they're now just more concerned with those things which are physical, not necessarily those things which are embodied through some discrete atom or particle of energy, to the degree where you're now even thinking about how fields function, and fields as ontological entities. So, a field, even though it exhibits itself through particles, we conceive that the field itself might be a physical entity we have to consider. And insofar as we're talking about how dialectics relates to that, it just doesn't. I mean, that's just the long and short of it. Dialectics doesn't really have anything to tell us about how to understand the ontological foundations of the world. And for me, that's kind of a reason to be skeptical of the dialectical method more generally, or at best, just to say that the dialectical method should be constrained to only talking about how society functions. And even then, I've got my doubts. However, it depends on who you ask about what dialectics is, because it seems like every person I talk to that gives me a description of dialectics gives me a different description of dialectics. That being said, people who are educated on dialectics, who have actually taken the time to research it and understand it, do seem to give me at least a somewhat consistent set of explanations. So for now, I think that's the answer I'll give. Aki says, and even if it was a science, science is made to adapt and evolve into better formulas. So why are they still stuck in the conditions of the early and mid 1900s and base modern revolution off of that? That's an extremely good point. Yeah, why are they still like repeating the science of people in the late 1800s and early 1900s? Like, we've literally gone through a quantum revolution in physics and a digital revolution in society and technology. It clearly needs to be updated, but it's not being, you know, they're just kind of clinging to the same old formulation. RJ Kilroy asks, Anark, do you think the society of the spectacle you mentioned earlier harms our chances of achieving libertarian socialism before it's too late? Yeah, I mean, yes. You know, the society of the spectacle is certainly an enormous holding maneuver by the mega machine. And therefore it sort of like confounds our conceptions of how things work. It deceives us, it confuses us, and pulls us into avenues which are ineffective. And obviously that's not very helpful. However, I also don't know how intentional any of it really was. It kind of seems like it was just the natural outcome of a society that was built in denial of the basic facts of how ecologies and environments and human beings work. And it was sort of natural that it would have to create an enormous protective belt of delusional reproductions to deceive and mislead people. So I'm getting a lot of questions here. I'm just kind of having to select through them because I'm just kind of staying up to date on the chat. Sam asks, what do you make of the Texas versus Fed standoff over the border, immigration, asylum, etc.? So for anybody that doesn't know, in this last week, basically the Supreme Court ruled that the border, the southern border of Texas, is actually to be determined by the federal government. And that is to say, what happens at that border, how it is protected, what is or is not built there is determined by the federal government and not the state of Texas. And so the federal government has ordered that barbed wire that was put up by the state of Texas at that southern border should be removed. However, instead of removing the barbed wire, the state of Texas ordered people to that border to put more barbed wire there. And then they tried to rally a bunch of other states in the United States to send their National Guard to the southern border so that they could stop federal military from coming down there to enforce what the federal government had determined. So you might have heard people talking about this as being a constitutional crisis. And in a sense, it is, only because there are disagreements over apparently what is being said in the Constitution. However, it's not really a constitutional crisis in the sense that there is any sort of legal problem. There's not. The Supreme Court already determined that the Constitution gives the federal government the right to determine what happens at the southern border, and Texas is just in clear contravention to the, decision of the Supreme Court and this text of the Constitution, which really just puts in place the supremacy of the federal government. So what's really happening here is that the Texas government really just wants to stir up more hatred. They are just trying to make sure that their base gets more red meat, to get them angry, to encourage sort of militia violence and stochastic violence. They're trying to get more of them to come down to that border in order to, it might appear, start some sort of violent conflict which might take place. And what this says to me is that the right wing has pretty much just given up completely on the idea of participating in a republic. They don't care about rule of law. They recognize that in the near future, they are just going to do outright violence in order to maintain their white supremacist, xenophobic ideals. And so what that means is we need to be preparing. This stuff at the southern border, even though it doesn't look like it is blowing up currently, it indicates that they don't have any intention of actually participating in a republic where everybody's interests are all supposed to be balanced against one another. If they don't get their way, they're just going to kill people. And these militias, you can just go look online and see what these people are saying. They are fucking hyped to kill brown people. They cannot wait to kill their fellow countrymen. They are ready to kill liberals. They are ready to kill any sort of radical leftist. You know, they're excited to start carrying out genocidal massacres. And if that makes you afraid, it should. And you should arm yourself. You should arm yourself. You should find other communities of resistance. You should begin creating militias. You should begin training in small unit tactics. You should begin researching how you can keep your community safe. You should begin trying to join anti-fascist organizations as best as possible, such that you can help stymie the expansion of these genocidal militias and prepare for the time when these right-wing governments are going to attempt to start some sort of civil war, or if not a civil war, some sort of civil conflict. It's very important that everybody takes seriously their ability to defend themselves against this sort of fascist incursion that we see taking place. This is very unlikely to remain contained within the bounds of the Republic. We absolutely must be prepared when the time comes when right-wingers try to start killing people. People often talk about anarchism being against a transitional phase between capitalism and communism, which to me seems more like a straw man critique, which does neither apply to theory nor practice. Yeah, I mean, you pretty much nailed it. It's just made up wholesale. The only reason they're saying this is because in their mind, the only transition that can take place is one that maintains the state. So they immediately just conceive that if you don't think that we have to keep the state, you don't believe in any sort of transitionary period. They don't have any conception of how prefiguration might take place. They don't have any conception of how we might actually just be able to do transition without a state. They are what you might call statist realists. They believe that the state absolutely must exist and that that is the only form of human governance that can persist. And that we have to take current state structures and slowly transform them, or do a revolution where we replace them with something which is almost an approximate copy. And this is their only conception. So when anarchists say, what are you doing? You're just putting in place the previous society, a copy of the previous society, but with red paint. They say, oh, what? You don't think there has to be any transition? You think we can just press the communism button? And it's like, no, just the transition isn't going to look like that. If the transition looks like that, it won't be a transition. And so instead of actually engaging with that argument that the tools they are using are contradictory to actually carrying out a transition, instead, they just pretend that what we're saying is we must instantaneously put in place communism, and that's what the anarchists want. Yeah, it's just a complete denial of what the actual anarchist critique is, as you say. And yeah, it's just a symptom of ignorance on their part. Knowledge and Defense says, if you had to choose between a fully planned economy or a market one, which do you think would be better to specifically start out with? Since Rojava, for example, has more co-ops than planning. There really aren't any fully planned economies. Even the ones that authoritarian leftists might point to were still never fully planned economies. There have never been fully planned economies. There's always some market component, and it's because of what I said on the last live stream earlier today before my computer crashed. You cannot just transition instantly to a fully planned economy because you are embedded in a world market where if you want to do any trade with the world market, you have to know the value of your goods. goods. And if you know the value of your goods, then that gets turned into internal accounting metrics, wherein you start to recognize if you are or are not maximizing profit for that external market. And that means you will then begin to impose market standards on your planning, even if you do plan. And then you will begin to essentially just reproduce the commodity form. And this is why we see that the planning ultimately just ends up devolving back into market forces again. So what I think is you're going to have a mixture of the two. However, I think it needs to be decentral planning and cooperative markets. So I think that you should have a market that's only cooperatives. And if it's not in the market cooperative, if it's not in the cooperative market, then it should be decentrally planned. It should be either held in the commons, just directly distributed from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, and so on. Come Letsov says, have you heard of the resistance committees in Sudan? Decentralized revolutionary movements that organize cultural events for the people, opposed to the Sudanese government and its ultra-violent militias. I have not. However, that's interesting. I'll look into that. Go Revolution, yes, the VOD will be saved on the channel. They automatically save. And by the way, for anybody that watches these, I just want to point out that there is just a tab that just says live, and it's all the live streams that have been done on the channel. So those are all there from very early in the channel's history. You can find one that's like a 2,000 subscriber celebration or something. Like that's how far back that it goes. So there's a bunch of live streams if you want to keep watching these. Yeah, Me Too says, it makes way more sense to transition with horizontal structures already in place instead of waiting for the state to slowly perish. That means you either think it will remove itself or that you will need a second revolution to reach communism. Yeah, I think it's incredibly ignorant to think that a system of hierarchy will ever dismantle itself. You know, this is, I think, the fundamental delusion of the authoritarian leftist conception is that hierarchical power structures, you know, just exist out of some necessity between relations, that they if they didn't have some reason to exist, they would just poof, vanish into air. That's just not how this works. Hierarchical power structures maintain themselves well after they are necessary. In fact, I would argue no hierarchical power structures that currently exist are necessary. Yet, they maintain themselves against that fact. Why might that be? It's because hierarchical power structures are inherently monopolization machines. And so any attempt that you make to undermine a hierarchical power structure, it's just going to try to crush you or subsume you. And their states are no different. Their states are always going to maintain their own perpetuation. They're going to continue the hierarchical structure of the state itself. So what that means is we have to create horizontal power structures, because horizontal power structures seek to perpetuate themselves as well. And when horizontal power structures perpetuate themselves, we are all empowered. So what we have to do is we have to start building the alternative in the with the opportunities that we are given. And yeah, that's the fundamental delusion of state socialism. I got a kitty here. She's clawing at me. I think that she's getting tired of me talking. She's like, geez, will you shut up? Like, you just keep talking. Pen Archive says, why is it called horizontal? Mostly I use this word horizontal to contrast with hierarchical, right? It's kind of metaphorical in its thrust, I suppose, insofar as we're talking about things having height or things being distributed like back, alongside one another. But the concept is the difference between concentration of power being within the hands of very few people as opposed to power being distributed across large groups of people. I say that hierarchical power structures are characterized by what I call authoritarianism and domination, and horizontal power structures are characterized by what I call libertarianism and mutuality. So these two principles are just opposites of one another. Hierarchical power structures have those two principles, and horizontal power structures have the other two principles. What tips or resources do you have for starting a worker-owned cooperative, and is it anarchist? You know, starting a worker-owned cooperative ultimately is going to look pretty similar to just starting a regular business insofar as that you are figuring up business plans. The difference is that all of your workers are shareholders. So that is just kind of your starting place. I think the main complication for starting a cooperative, making it majorly different from starting a corporation or just a regular business, is that it can be more difficult to find investment because cooperatives are inherently going to shy away from having a group of shareholders who control how their cooperative functions because those people aren't workers. So those people don't actually provide value to the company, and therefore they shouldn't be deriving any interest from the profit of that company. And in that sense, it can be hard to find investors. I think one of the things that can be done is that you can tell investors, well, you don't get shares in the company, you don't get any, controlling interest, but we will pay you back, the value of what you invested with a little bit of a premium. We'll give you back 110% instead of just 100%. And then maybe you could say the amount that is paid back to them just comes out of profits, not out of revenue. That'd probably be a good way to interact with investors. But even then, I think that's kind of sketchy because then you're in a situation where you are producing to pay back investors. But I think the key here is that no investor should ever get shares in the cooperative. That's just not how this should work. The only people who get shares are the workers. Yeah, Black Flags and Roses says, as an anarchist, I don't reject commodities produced, but the exploitation of labor and the system that foments accumulation of capital. Yeah, I still think that commodity production does have perverse incentives that are negative. It creates negative social relations. However, I will say that my main objection is indeed the exploitation of labor. Now, you'll get plenty of leftists who will say, well, in cooperatives, workers just exploit themselves. Yeah, I mean, that's true in a sense, but it is good that we dissolve the relation between the boss and the worker. We dissolve the relation between the capitalist who only makes money by recirculation of their capital and the workers who produce all of the value in society. I think it is good that we dissolve that relation and disempower the capitalists. So I do support worker cooperatives. I do think they are prefigurative in that sense. Long Defiant says, in arguing with libertarians lately, I've just been calling them ultra liberals. I refuse to let them keep the term. It's so clarifying for me. Yeah, sometimes I'll call them propertarians. That comes from Bookchin. Ludwig Rabinost says, is it necessary for a revolution to have an organized workers' movement? If so, why is there no international organized workers' movement at the moment? I would say yes. I mean, that's one component of it. You know, I'm not an economic reductionist, so it's not only about workers. But yeah, absolutely. You're going to need international organization of all sorts. You know, my recommendation is that, you know, the base level of organization should be just council structures. They don't have to be specifically for workers or specifically for any given issue. You just need, you know, these sort of civil bodies wherein people can come together and to make decisions about all of the systems they interact with and the alternatives that they're part of. So you do indeed need a workers' movement. That's part of it. As for your second part, like, why does it not exist? Well, I mean, I would just say that just because it needs to exist doesn't mean that it does, right? You know, it did at one point. In fact, you know, we had numerous internationals. We didn't only have one workers international. We had many taking place all at the same time throughout the mid 1800s, all the way through until really, I'd say, like the fall of the Soviet Union. We had lots of internationals, and they do still exist, but they just don't have nearly the amount of reach and coordination as they once did. Margot Sorn says, how do you engage with less engaged or further right/centrist folk in your day-to-day life? Is your friend group exclusively libertarian socialist? I think it's about picking your battles, right? So like when you're interacting with like normal people, I would suggest not turning every conversation political and not taking every bait that's on the line. I would say, if you feel like you have time to talk to somebody about the problems, then you should talk to them about the problems under those circumstances. But you should not be constantly trying to bring them back into arguments about politics. As for are all of my friends libertarian socialists? I don't think all of them are. However, over the years, more and more of them have become libertarian socialists or out and out anarchists. The majority of the ones that I hang out with in my daily life, yes, they are. But it wasn't always that way. You know, a lot of them were otherwise for many years. And several of them only really came around to it here in these last few years after they saw how bad things were getting. Dr. R. Buen Oliva says, Propertarians was the pejorative the anarchists of Anares called the capitalists of their sister world in Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. I didn't know that, but that makes sense. That adds up. Eric Gray's here. Hey, everyone. Finally got off from work. Welcome to the chat. Ludwig asks, what are the reasons past experiments have failed and what should be done differently this time? I think you could probably get the answer to that in my series, A Modern Anarchism. So if you watched parts 1, 2, and 3, you'd probably get pretty good answers to that question. John Doe, if you had a time machine, what are you doing with it? I don't know. That's a big question, my friend. Not entirely sure. I'd have to think on that one. I haven't really thought about it. Yeah, I can't think of any one thing I could do that would fix it. I don't know, maybe go back to John Brown and prepare him for the fact that the wagons were going to be late. Let's see here. Oh, I was also going to essentially say what I said at the beginning of the stream from earlier that just like ended, in case anyone's only listening to this one and they didn't listen to the last one. So channel update is that my new channel schedule, the way I'm going to try to do it is the first Friday of every month, I'm going to do a live stream. This is my plan. Okay. And then the remaining Fridays, I'm just going to do videos like you've seen. Okay. You know, the Anarch Abridged videos, the Anarch Responds videos. And on Mondays, I will continue to release clips. For anybody that's been watching the channel, that's what's being released on Mondays. They are clips from my live streams. And if you want to help me make more clips to go on those Mondays, you have some significant power over the clips that will be released, because so far I've been choosing them based on what people have like time tagged in the comments underneath the video. So if in any of the live streams you hear me saying something you thought was interesting, something that would make a good clip to release on Mondays, just put the timestamp in a comment beneath and maybe a short description of what it is that I was talking about that you found interesting. And there's a decent chance that will end up being clipped at some point or another and released on one of the Mondays. The next thing I was going to say, and this is what I was talking about at the end of the last stream before it crashed, was that I have decided that I'm going to do a series of videos where I talk about both existing autonomous regions and historical movements, and historical autonomous regions and historical movements that were horizontalist, libertarian socialist, or anarchist more broadly. And I actually already have a list of these examples that I'm going to be using. And I'm going to just put it here in the chat for everybody to take a look at. If you can see any that haven't been included, this is a copy of the original document where you can just add entries as you please. So obviously practice a little bit of responsibility here and not mangling the document for others. But this one's going to be completely open for y'all to edit. And, you know, this list will end up informing a bunch of videos that I'm going to do. I'm going to do one of these videos over every single one of the entries on this list. So there it is. You know, click through to the link there. Also note that it is in the description to this video. I was looking at it when the stream crashed last time, and I'm wondering if it had something to do with why the stream crashed. So I'm not going to open it back up and see if y'all are clicking through to it right now, because I don't really want to risk that all over again. I'll probably go on this stream for about another 45 minutes because I do have things I need to do. I'll be going out and tabling at an event tonight for Cooperation Tulsa, so I do need some time in between now and then to like print a bunch of zines and so on. Yeah. Knowledge and Defense asks, would you say Marx was more authoritarian, befriending Engels and rejecting anarchism, or more libertarian, wanting a bottom-up power structure, criticizing the Paris Commune centralization? I think that Marx was more authoritarian earlier in his life, and later in his life became more libertarian. I think that if you look at Marx early on, he was mostly just a social democrat. He actually did just believe that parliamentarism was the way to, you know, create a strong workers' movement. And he thought that that was the way that you seized the state. Then he slowly became more revolutionary in that sense. He began to think that maybe you could just have a bottom-up workers' movement that seized things directly. And then, boom, the Paris Commune. I think the Paris Commune completely broke him of his parliamentarian delusions. He and Engels, might I add, both became much more libertarian, became much more believing in a bottom-up workers' movement. And as you said, to the degree where he looked at the Paris Commune and he said, actually, if you're going to do it this way, that's still too centralized. Like, your failure was centralization and also really not preparing properly for what was going to take place. So, yeah. Engels less so than Marx, because Engels wasn't nearly as observant or educated or intelligent as Marx was. But yeah, both of them became more libertarian after the Paris Commune and actually stopped advocating for the state in that sense. And I actually read out a quote from Engels where he thought that we should just stop calling things like the Paris Commune states and start calling them, what did he say? We should not call them communes. He said we should call them something else, but not super important. No. But then Marxists, quote unquote, really just kind of vulgarized Marx's work later on. You know, I think that they were very much just opportunists, people like Lenin, for example. David Lahaz Gill says, would you consider contacting Daniel from What is Politics to talk or something? He and Lucky Black Cat along you are pretty good. I have talked a little bit with Lucky Black Cat. She's wonderful. I haven't talked with Daniel from What is Politics, but I do watch his channel. I think we've like maybe traded a message or two on Twitter or something, but only in like comments. In any occasion, I don't do a whole lot of collaboration videos, but I'd be open to it. I'd be down to doing a collaboration if it were, you know, the right circumstances. But they're both really cool. Y'all should go subscribe to What is Politics and Lucky Black Cat. Pervin Wall says, can you explain the Kyriarchy and like where does this concept come from? So I'll start backwards. The concept of the Kyriarchy comes from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who was an intersectional feminist. And her concept of the Kyriarchy is basically, the Kyriarchy is the combination of all the social hierarchies in an area. So instead of thinking individually about patriarchy or, you know, white supremacy or cis heteronormativity or any of these other things, or the state, capitalism, her concept of the Kyriarchy is essentially all of these combined. It's a questioning and analysis of how these all prop each other up and how they are sort of mixed together into a seamless structure. And I utilize the concept of the Kyriarchy in my own work, mixing it together with the analysis of Lewis Mumford, specifically his conception of the mega machine. And so in my works, A Modern Anarchism, I call this the Kyriarchal mega machine, which is a mouthful, but it gets the point across about what I'm talking about. So yeah, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. Daniel asks, how would you place yourself in terms of the nature of reality debate? More toward a critical realist perspective like Graeber, or objective reality, or constructionist post-structuralism? I'm what you would call a structural realist. That is to say, I don't think that our knowledge systems are perfect representations of the world. I think they're more like tracings of a structure which exists with or without our opinions. That is to say, this is a statement that there is an objective reality and there's an objective structure to the way that the rules of the universe work, and we exist in an objective reality, but that the systems we develop are approximations of those structures of society. And that as we develop further and further scientific knowledge, what we are doing is we are developing more and more faithful approximations of those inherent structures of reality. So this perspective is called structural realism. Sometimes very, very associated is some concept you might call like speculative realism. Eric Gray donated $5. Thank you very much. And he says, I'm planning on making a Black Anarchism reading list and posting it in the Discord server. Hopefully I'll have it posted before the end of the month. Fantastic. That's great. You know, I created one in my reading list, but I assume you probably have a lot more good ones in mind. Also, I haven't read all of them. So I know, for example, what is it? A Nation with No Name. I think that one I haven't read yet, but I've heard is really good. Anarchy, he says, vanguardism seems very Eurocentric and like paternalistic colonialism. Doesn't "we must educate these backwards peasants" sound awfully like "we must civilize these backwards natives"? Yeah, absolutely agreed. Yeah, I think the proper approach is in recognizing that, yes, you need to raise people's, radical consciousness, but that what you should really be doing is creating systems of self-governance where people can determine their own futures, determine how they want to organize themselves together. Yeah. Also, I should note, if you want access to the Anark Discord server, you should become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Anark. And you get access no matter which tier you choose. In a general sense, which tier you choose is just a judgment of how much value you place on the channel, right? Like, how much do you want to help the channel grow? So the more you pledge, that's what it really represents. So you can get access to the Discord server for as little as $2, because the tiers are like $2, $5, $7, $10, and $20. Also, you could customize the amount that you donate if you like. But that will get you access to the Discord server, and the Discord server is great. We have all kinds of fantastic conversations there about theory and praxis and all kinds of things. It's a bunch of libertarian socialists and anarchists hanging out together. Knowledge and Defense says, you would think then that unity between Marxists and anarchists would be easier after that later development in Marx's life. Why don't anarchist critics of Leninism bring this up more often? They used to. However, after the USSR, many anarchists chose to just distance themselves from Marx and Marxism in general. So before the USSR, before the USSR, many anarchists actually did identify with many of Marx's analytical tools that he had developed. In fact, if you read Bakunin's The Capitalist System, it's pretty well just an anarchist restatement of Marx's analysis of capitalism. Moreover, Bakunin himself was a student of Marx for a very long time and continued to be even after the First International. Kyriarchy, who was considered to be one of the earliest sort of insurrectionary anarchists, actually one of the earliest anarchists, period, he produced what is considered to be the most faithful summary of Capital by Marx of any person ever. In fact, Marx himself gave Kyriarchy's summary of Capital his approval, and that was rare. I don't think that happened in any other occasion. So with that in mind, there used to be, anarchists used to be quite a bit more sympathetic to Marx's analysis. However, after the authoritarian left began to bastardize Marx and use him as justification for their state structures, the anarchists instead chose to distance themselves from Marx and began to highlight the sort of independent lineage of anarchism aside from Marx's thoughts. And I think that they overcorrected a little bit. I understand why they did so, especially given that if you talk to a normal person about what does Marxism mean, they don't really know anything about what Marxism is, right? They have no idea what that is. If you were to ask them what Marxism is, that would probably just be associated with the USSR or China or something, right? It wouldn't really have almost anything to do with understanding what Marx's critique of capitalism was, or what Marx's broader philosophical understanding of political change was. So I think that the way we should be looking at it is kind of returning to those previous roots, where it's not like we're going around promoting Marx all the time, but I think that we should rationally recognize that Marx's analysis was complex, nuanced. He got a lot right. He was a very profound thinker and a very intelligent man that really genuinely did seem to care about the issues he was writing about. However, we should maintain a critical perspective, recognizing that not only did Marx get a lot of things wrong over the course of his life, but that his words clearly were able to be co-opted and recuperated by authoritarians who then used his conceptions as justification to put in place extremely repressive state apparatuses, which ultimately just reproduced capitalism. Masuda Trent says, are you going to make a video of key historical anarchist events? Kind of. That's kind of what I'm planning on doing with that series I was just mentioning earlier, where I'm going to go over this list of both historical and existing autonomies and horizontal movements and discuss each of them and sort of give some insight into what they were or are, as it may be, and discuss their influences and where they came from, where they have gotten their power or how they have lost power, as the case may be, with historical examples. That will probably come at the end of the list, however. I plan on going through the existing ones first. So the series, I'm pretty sure I'm going to call Liberation in Action, but I'm still workshopping the title. However, I will release the first one next Friday, and it will probably just be an overview of that list. So once again, that list that will form the content of all of these videos to come up for, honestly, probably months to come is in the description, and I will paste it once again here in the chat. I guess I'll just mention, the Patreon last month was actually the first time it's taken a hit in a long time, which is to say it's the first time that I haven't gained new recurring subscribers. So if you want to help me kind of recuperate my losses in that sense and help get me back on track for the growth of the channel, that would be fantastic. I'd appreciate it greatly. Lily says, I just watched a response to the question about Marxist materialism. I hope you upload that as a clip. You articulated my thoughts exactly. Cool. Yeah, no, you should timestamp that as a comment below the video. That really expedites my process in clipping out these pieces of the live streams. If you want the non-Marxist origins of Lenin, you should watch my series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary, because essentially what I lay out is Lenin is more similar to Auguste Blanqui and Ferdinand Lassalle than he is to Marx, and I give direct citation to demonstrate as much. No worries, Curran. I appreciate you. That looks like Greek. I think I do this every time. I don't know what the name says in Greek. However, I appreciate you showing up each time. What libertarian socialist channels can you recommend? I know Andrewism, Zoe Baker, Lucky Black Cat, but that's all. Can you recommend some another? My nickname is spelled platformist right at the end of that. Okay, so I'll try to remember that. That means platformist. Gotcha. Understood. Another one I would add to the list just off the top of my head is Red Plateaus. He hasn't released anything in a while at this point, or rather, I think it's two people. Red Plateaus hasn't released anything in a while, but they really are some of the best videos in understanding libertarian Marxism. And as I said, there is a significant weight to the sort of libertarian or horizontalist interpretation of Marx, right? And if you want to get started in understanding that interpretation, kind of understanding what Marx really meant in that sense, I highly recommend you go subscribe to Red Plateaus. Red Plateaus is fantastic. Absolutely phenomenal. Honestly, one of my favorite channels, even though they haven't uploaded in quite a while at this point. Knowledge in Defense says, is it true that Rosa Luxemburg became more of a Leninist later in life? If so, I've never read anything to say as much. Everything I've read from Rosa Luxemburg during the USSR was that she was disapproving of what Lenin was doing. She actually thought that he was taking the wrong approach, and she gave numerous criticisms of not only his interpretations of Marx, but also his conception of how revolutions were carried out. So you can find tons of Rosa Luxemburg criticizing Lenin. I've never found anything of Rosa Luxemburg agreeing with Lenin, but I'm not like a scholar of Rosa Luxemburg, so. insofar as like recommending anarchist and libertarian socialist channels, that's probably another video I'm going to do. Is I'm just going to compile a big list of channels I recommend. And it's not going to be one of those, big channel recommends a bunch of small channels things. No, it's just going to be the channels I think are good, big or small, just the ones I would say people should watch, I got people sending me messages elsewhere here. Owen Belazos gives some great additions here. Also, go subscribe to Radical Reviewer. In fact, I just did a collaboration with Radical Reviewer. He's also an anarcho-communist. He does book reviews. So he reads through these books and he just writes, reviews of them. And he does a lot of different kinds of books. He does radical anarchist theory. He'll read authoritarian leftist texts. He even reads like anarcho-capitalist or propertarian texts. So those videos are really great. The collaboration I just did with Radical Reviewer was over Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and I think it turned out really well. I think you'll get a really good summary of what Fanon is talking about in Wretched of the Earth if you go watch that one. So let me bring that one up. I'll do the work for you here. How about that? Okay, we're gonna go Radical Reviewer. Sorry, I didn't even get through the rest of the people in that list, but I'll get to it here in a second.
If you need to...
All right, there we go. Boom. There we go. That link should take you to the collaboration. The other one in the list, the other one's in the list, however. Where'd it go? Oh, did I lose it? Oh yeah, Radical Reviewer Re-Education. Yeah, I think his name is Aaron. He's actually been watching a lot of my channel lately. I've been seeing his comments beneath a lot of my videos, which is super cool because he made his channel well before mine ever existed, and he had grown quite a bit bigger. And so that's really cool to have him watching the channel lately. It's an honor. But you should also go subscribe to his channel, which is called Re-Education. It's really good. Where's the list? Keeps getting away from me. Jonas Sika, I think that's how that's said. Is it Sika? That's a pretty cool channel. They used to be called Cuck Philosophy, but they renamed to Jonas Sika, I think maybe for obvious reasons. Audible Anarchist, that's a place you can find a bunch of anarchist audiobooks, and I've used it quite a few times, and I think y'all should too. Don't fetishize reading things. You can just use screen readers and stuff, okay? It's there's no shame in consuming text, in whatever way is natural for you, in whatever way will help you actually consume the text. It's more important that you consume it than that you do it in some particular way, which people think is more or less valuable. So yeah, Audible Anarchist is a great one. The last one is Leftist Cooks, which I've never heard of. So I can't really recommend that one, but I'll look into it as well. What starter text on ecology would you recommend? I generally recommend people start with Ecology and Revolutionary Thought by Murray Bookchin. Knowledge and Defense, thoughts on the accusations of war crimes and bad prisoner treatment in Rojava and the mass poverty in the Zapatistas. On the first one, I really haven't heard any war crimes. I've heard people saying that they've been managing their state with relation to minority populations not very well. However, most of that criticism is pretty outdated. The examples, the articles that they're giving are mostly all the way back in like 2016 or something. So very outdated stuff. As far as bad prisoner treatment, I'd like to just emphasize that the vast majority of all of their prisoners, and I mean vast majority, over 90% or more of all their prisoners are terrorists. They're literally ISIS. They're prisoners of war. Okay. These are not just people being arrested for theft or something like that. You know, that's not what they're dealing with in Rojava. They're literally dealing with, you know, an ISIS insurgency, and that's who is mostly imprisoned in their prisons. So I don't know anything about bad prisoner treatment, but then mass poverty in the Zapatistas. I mean, that region, Chiapas, was already one of the poorest regions in all of Mexico. That's part of the reason why the Zapatistas were able to spur them to revolutionary action. And it should be said, they are less poverty stricken now. They have less problems with you know, all of the poverty and diseases of poverty that they once had after the revolution and the creation of themselves as an autonomous region. When did things end up so sour between Marx and Bakunin? Easy answer, the First International. If you haven't read about the First International and the feud between Marx and Bakunin, you should, because it's one of the most sort of disappointing and disgraceful events in leftist history. Oh yeah, Seriously Wrong. That's a great one. Seriously Wrong, the guys over there make this incredible podcast. It's Seriously Wrong, like SRSLY, and it's fantastic. It's so good. It's like a utopian socialist, library socialist podcast, and I'm super into it. I love the work they put out. I've been on there, in fact. If you want to listen to my episode, it's on my YouTube channel, but obviously it's also it's uploaded on all of their platforms. Yeah, no, Seriously Wrong is great. Andrew P, gonna try asking this one more time. Sorry, like I said, I haven't been like going through the backlog this time. I'm just like letting the chat go by and like reading them as like they come up. He says, has Cooperation Tulsa tried planting a food forest? It's a sustainable and efficient alternative to industrial agriculture. Actually, that is something we're planning. Yeah, we plan on putting in place a variety of permacultural techniques on the land that we have available to us. And food forest is one of those things. Knowledge and Defense says, it's just that I often hear from authoritarians claiming that Luxemburg and Lenin became buddies later. If so, I just don't know anything about it. Maybe it's the case, but I have no idea. It seems like it would be weird that that were the case, given that didn't Rosa Luxemburg die before Lenin died? I'm pretty sure, right? I don't know what the order of events is on that, but I've never read anything about Luxemburg and Lenin becoming buddies. Would you consider doing a more good faith version of Vosh debates with authoritarians? Nah, probably not. I don't really want to do debates on this channel. I would only under very specific circumstances have a debate. And that would be in a situation where I think the person could engage in good faith. However, the sad truth is that most authoritarian leftists I've seen cannot engage in good faith. They usually don't have a very good understanding of theory. They don't have a very good understanding of history. They are basically just arguing for one-sided talking points. They're kind of snake oil salesmen a lot of the time. And I've said as much. You know, most authoritarian leftists I consider to be co-opters. I think that their main approach in revolution is to try to jump into the driver's seat of something they didn't create. So I don't have a very good opinion of most of them. And I, in my experience, have found that most of them aren't even capable of having a real debate. They either melt down and get angry. They start slinging straw men. They have no idea what their own theory is. For example, I would say the majority of authoritarian leftists I've spoke with don't understand Marx at all. In fact, they don't even really understand Lenin. They just understand a bunch of things they've been told in their echo chambers about those people. So that means that when I debate with authoritarian leftists, like when I'm like arguing with them on Twitter, for example, I'm just always in this process of educating them, which is infuriating because they don't even have a grasp of their own theory. So I'm in this position where I'm like, yeah, no, you're wrong. So like, let's start from scratch again. This is actually what's going on. This is what he actually believed and so on. And that's just so frustrating. There's probably a handful of them that I would be willing to debate, but just the amount of bad faith and, bad knowledge is a huge hurdle to overcome to the degree where I don't even think it would be productive. So yeah, that's kind of my base, answer to that question. Eric Gray, again, donating $5. I appreciate it, Eric. Also, I plan on discussing more about schooling and education throughout the year, given my background as a teacher. Yeah, that would be great. I've had numerous people talk to me about how they want resources on school abolition or just really like how to restructure the school to be more appropriate in a sort of horizontalist method and so on. So that would probably be much appreciated by a lot of people. Is my camera out of focus? Oh, it must have only been out of focus for a second. It looks like it's good now. Rosa Luxemburg was murdered in 1919. Well, she was criticizing Lenin up through the revolution and after the revolution. That means that they would have only had 2 years to have, quote unquote, become buddy-buddy. And in that period of time, there was also criticisms by Rosa Luxemburg of what was being done in the USSR. So that is an extremely slim margin of time for them to have, quote unquote, become buddies. Seems very unlikely that characterization is correct. Anarchy, he says, the straw man that statists put on anarchists saying it's just individualism is so weird considering horizontal structures literally cannot rely solely on the individual, but instead the collective. Yeah, exactly. That just kind of demonstrates how little their actual understanding of the topics at hand is. And that's one of the reasons why I probably would not waste my time debating them on their platform or my platform. As Voltaire says, genuinely the thing that first drove me away from authoritarian leftism was just how much they straight up lie about history. It's exactly right. Yeah. Sort of the frustrating part about it. By the way, you want to actually understand what happened in the Russian Revolution? Y'all should read Maurice Britton's The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control is probably one of the most important books you could read, dismantling all of the lies about what took place in the USSR. It's, basically laying out the revolutionary period and laying out how all of this was actually done by huge federations of bottom-up movements. And the Bolsheviks rushed in the last few months and claimed that they had done it all and jumped into the driver's seat and then fucked it all up, essentially. Got a new member, Linky Dubs. Thank you for joining, Linky Dubs. I appreciate it. Also, Linky Dubs, if you want to message me somewhere, I can give you an invite to the Discord. I think that's one of the downsides of being a member on YouTube is that it's kind of harder to get a hold of me, so I can give you a link to the Discord. So just, if you can get a hold of me somehow, that would be great. And then I can give you a link. Your camera's been out of focus the whole stream. I have a Twitch stream up and the focus is fine, so I don't think it's on my end. I mean, I'm looking at OBS right now and it looks fine. I can refocus it, but Yeah, looks the same. You could send me an email. My email is barryonpipeline@gmail.com. You could also message me on Twitter. That would be another place. Knowledge and defense. What makes criticizing authoritarian leftists so frustrating is that it actually is true that Western propaganda spread a lot of lies about them. So it's hard to separate the truth from USSR lies and US lies. Absolutely agreed. In fact, that's one of the most infuriating parts about it. I run into it all the time when I'm talking with normal people about the USSR. You know, they'll start saying things about the USSR and, you know, I'll point out to them that, you know, oh, I'm not a supporter of the USSR. In fact, I have a great deal of criticisms about the USSR. And then they start telling me their criticisms and I'm like, I don't know. That's not even true. That's not accurate. That didn't happen. You know, like that's a lie. Who told you that? You know, like, or their criticisms will be like silly stuff, like pro-capitalist stuff where it's like, well, you know, the state controlled everything. And I'm like, yeah, true. That's not what the issue was though, right? Like if you're asking me to choose between central planning and capitalism, generally I'd choose central planning, but it wasn't even really centrally planned for very long. It just had a huge amount of federal work programs for most of its existence. There was a short period actually after the NEP that they did do some central planning, but it still wasn't even complete. Yeah, no, there's just a lot of lies have been told about the USSR, which really sucks because there are really actually good criticisms of the USSR. And authoritarian leftists aren't telling you any of those criticisms. Their criticisms are always just like, well, they should have done it harder. You know, they should have purged more. Well, what they needed was more party brainwashing. They should have done less delegation from the workers' councils. Like, you know, silly stuff. Me too. Yeah, most of the work was done bottom up during the Russian Revolution, and you still see MLs blaming anarchists and horizontalism for the failures of modern leftist movements, insisting on the importance of the vanguard party. Yeah, the vanguard party looks like it does a lot because it jumps into the driver's seat after all the work's already been done. And so they have a lot of power to, you know, broadcast to everyone that they're the reason everything took place. And it's extremely frustrating. And they wonder, for example, why is the PSL not bringing the revolution? Why has CPUSA been around for 100 years and yet no revolution? Super weird. We got the vanguard parties. Where are the revolutions? Yeah, it's not how it works. Slower Panther, thoughts on the argument that anarchists have played little to no role in the decolonization process throughout the world? I mean, I would disagree insofar as that anarchists have been very present in a variety of movements, including, for example, in Mexico, where there's a huge anarchist movement, and anarchist conceptions of the world actually became so integrated in the Mexican society and in the broader indigenous movements that their approach is very anarchistic, very horizontal at this point. It should be said, anarchists are really not devoted to any given revolution or movement calling itself anarchist. It doesn't really matter if they call themselves anarchist. We don't care. We only care about the methods. We care about horizontal power structures being created. If it were the case that tomorrow the word anarchism were wiped from existence, yet you know, confederations of horizontal council structures began to rise up and create autonomous territories, I wouldn't even care. I mean, I would be sad perhaps that the history of anarchism had been lost, but at the end of the day, liberation took place anyway, and I wouldn't even care whether it were called anarchism or not. Also, insofar as we're talking about anarchists having nothing to do with decolonial movements, it sounds like what we're saying is anarchists weren't the ones who carried out state projects, right? Because I think probably what they're looking at is like the creation of these sort of like quote unquote socialist states, and they see that as being decolonization. And of course, there's some element of decolonization in a lot of those. For example, they kicked out the colonizers and they created their own state. And that's fair. But those were all bourgeois revolutions. And it's better to have a bourgeois revolution where you control your own nation through a capitalist economy than to, of course, be colonized. That much is obviously the case. So I don't, bemoan any of these examples. However, none of these examples led to actual liberation for the people. Insofar as there's still a bourgeois society, insofar as capitalism and the state still reign, these people are not liberated. So in none of these examples do we actually see the people being liberated from these structures. Instead, what we see is the creation of new national bourgeoisie. We see the creation of new capitalist states that are now instead staffed by people that are indigenous to those places. So it's not to say that those things weren't positive, but those are not great examples if we're talking about socialist revolutionary movements. Sam M became sponsor. Thank you very much, Sam. I appreciate it. Yeah, knowledge and defense. But then the authoritarians take that and pretend that it's all lies because they dismiss all opposition as automatically Red Scare McCarthyism. This is what poisons nuanced discourse on it. Yeah, absolutely. They're absolutely unwilling to hear the real criticisms because they think all criticisms that aren't their extremely milquetoast non-criticisms, those are all McCarthyism. Those are all U.S. propaganda. No need. U.S. propaganda, completely unneeded. You can just point to how the Bolsheviks directly undermined the power of the workers. Once again, if you want to learn about that, part 2 of The State is Counter-Revolutionary is where I talk about it. But also, you could just read The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control by Maurice Brinton. Pin archives. Yeah, the critiques from auths is always that orgs aren't centralized enough. In my tome on Politogram, a Leninist said the BPP failed because it didn't centralize enough, which is hilarious because if you actually listen to any of the people who are alive from the Black Panthers, they say literally the exact opposite. In fact, the BPP, after it splintered, the majority of the notable thinkers, the notable figures we have today who were once in the Black Panther Party became anarchists. In fact, many of them are the foundational thinkers of Black anarchism. And they became anarchists precisely because the BPP was too centralized, and that's why it failed by their estimation. You can find a really great analysis of the failure of the Black Panther Party by Lorenzo Camboa Irvin in his book Anarchism and the Black Revolution. If you even just want to read that part, it stands alone really well. So, just go look up Anarchism and the Black Revolution and go look at the part ML, like go, do the find function to go find ML in the text. And you'll just find him absolutely ripping apart the Vanguard model and holding it directly responsible for the failure of the Black Panther Party. Andrew P., if you ever end up finding any evidence that Luxembourg, quote unquote, became a Bolshevik, I'd be very interested to read it. It's not that I wouldn't believe that it's possible. It just seems really unlikely. If you find anything, just tell me. Sam says, changed over from Patreon, had to update my payment method. Cheers. Also, is the document as laid out on the plans for the historical videos laid out already in order, or are you going to pick and choose from the list? I'm probably going to do it in order. Probably going to do it in order. I'm going to do the existing ones first, and then I'll go through the historical ones. that's why it matters that if you all contribute, because, you know, like I'm going to be proceeding through that list in order. So if I get through a section and you add something to that section afterwards, then it may or may not get covered. I guess it would depend on how big the exclusion had been. But if you include them before I get to that section, then it's a very good chance that I'm actually going to include that part. However, we are coming up on my time limit here. I really do need to end the stream here because I have some things I got to do today. I need to get prepared for the tabling that comes later. So I am just going to have to call it here. It was good talking with y'all. This is not as long as it usually is, but also I just want to remind you, if there were parts of the stream you liked, then go down below, time stamp them in the comments, tell me which parts you liked and why you liked them. And those are very likely to become clips to be released on Monday. Also, I just want to suggest that if you value the work that I'm doing on this channel, go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Anark. And that will get you access to the Discord server where we're having conversations like this all the time. You know, the kind of stuff you're asking me about here, there's people in that server that have all kinds of knowledge and would also love to engage with you on all of these topics. So yeah, I think that's it for today. It was good talking with y'all, and I think I'm going to end it there. See y'all later.